a famous cartoon of a small boy in bed reading the final problem with a look of complete alarm on his face that this is the end. And I think a lot of people were seized by the impulse. Somebody also said, I think Michael Chabon said, all art is a history of cut and paste. All fiction is fan fiction. The Odyssey is a sequel to the Iliad. The Aeneid is a sequel to the Odyssey. Mozart reorchestrated Messiah. Everybody takes a whack at Carmen. Everybody's played James Bond. Everybody's written James Bond. You add, you cut, you paste, and you stand on the shoulders or ride on them of people who have gone before, and that seems to be how it works. Even Moby Dick was based on a real whale named Mocha Dick. Emma Bovary was a real person, and so on and so forth. So I can't remember your question, but this is definitely my answer.
No, just how popular in the public consciousness at that time.
He had started to fade a little bit. God knows there were many, many Sherlock Holmes movies, most of which I cordially loathe. I never
Really?
understood Watson as an idiot. I never understood why a really sophisticated genius wants to hang out with a jerk. And that just bugged me. And that Nigel Bruce character, I couldn't believe was the one who wrote the stories. I'm very, very, in this area at least, terribly conservative about how I want Holmes to come across. And I think writing the 7% Solution was an attempt to correct things, to make Watson not a complete numbskull and so forth, and to stop taking them wildly out of period and putting them in World War II or something. It seemed, it was not satisfying to me. It was not believable. And I think as an 11-year-old kid, the thing that I found about the Holmes stories when I read them was they were believable to me. You know, a grown-up person might feel differently, but at the time I thought, and sometimes he loses. Sometimes he's wrong. And that made him real, you know, because that never happened to Perry Mason. Perry Mason always wins. He never loses. And at that point, you start to confuse heroes with gods. People got mad when I depicted Holmes as a cocaine addict. And I said, well, I didn't depict him as the cocaine addict. Arthur Conan Doyle depicted him as and they went into torturous explanations as to why he was teasing Watson and it wasn't true. And I said, you should not be so worried. If a man jumps into a raging torrent to save a drowning child, I think we can agree that he performs a heroic act. But if the same man jumps into the same river to save the same child and does it with a ball and chain attached to him, does that make him more heroic or less? I say more. If Holmes is functioning despite the crippling aspects of an addiction, then to my way of thinking, you shouldn't be frightened of that. I'm not interested in superheroes. I'm only interested in heroes.
Well, I mean, we talk about the enduring appeal of some of these characters that, you know, and to bring up another, psychologist, Carl Jung, who talks about the collective unconscious and the archetypes, you know.
Well, something about the dynamic duo,
Yeah.
starting with, I think, Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. And Quixote is also a deducer, right? He says it's not a windmill, it's a giant. And Sancho is always going, no fooling. Egad, Holmes, you're remarkable. Alonso Quijana. And by the same token, I think Pygmalion by Shaw is a complete ripoff of Sherlock Holmes. Henry Higgins of 27A Wimpole Street with Colonel Pickering, just back from India, is not very different from the residents of 221B Baker Street with Dr. Watson just back from Afghanistan, and Mrs. Hudson presides over one household, and what's the name of the lady? Mrs. Pierce is the other one, and Higgins is always deducing from people's accents where they're from, and everybody's saying, "Blimey, how'd you come to know that?" and so on. So I think Henry Higgins is clearly one of the two inspirations for Henry Higgins. The other one being Shaw's mother's singing coach, a man, and possibly he was other things as well, a man named Vandeleur Lee.
It's funny, they mention in some scene in the new book, which I got to tell you is an absolute blast. I really love the new book.
Pay attention.
And, set in 1916, and we were talking in the back a little bit, there's a lot going on in 1916. The
world
Great
was
War.
coming to an end.
Yeah. We can kind of jump around whatever you'd like to do, but take us to 1916 and what's going on with Holmes and Watson. This is a year after the last, or 2 years after the last adventure.
The inspiration for this manuscript, there were several, but one of them is a short story in the Holmes canon called His Last Bow. His Last Bow is a curious story because it's narrated in the third person, and it's not narrated by Watson, but he's in it. And in that story, which is set in 1914, August, which is described as the hottest August of all time, we learn that Sherlock Holmes has spent the previous 2 years undercover in America as an Irish sympathizer named Gideon Altamont. And in that, and he's hunting down the German spy master von Bork. And in that story, His Last Bow, Bork is arrested and swears vengeance on Holmes as he's taken away. And that is part of the jumping off point. Holmes was in America. Who else was in America? One of them, people who was in America at the time, was an Anglo-Irish journalist named Roger Casement. And Roger Casement, in 1905, had been knighted by the King of England for services to humanity. I think it may be the first time that phrase was used, because he got out of King Leopold's Belgian Congo and revealed to an appalled world what was going on there, where they were chopping off people's hands, and so that he was knighted. But when the First World War broke out, there was a big movement, not only in Ireland but also in India, which happened again in the Second World War. These colonies wanted their independence. And while the mother country had her back to the wall, seemed like a good time to try for it. So Roger Casement, who was in New York, did I say Roger? I can't remember what his first name is. It is right. So he was in America, which has an enormous Irish-American population, rabble-rousing for Irish independence. The moment war was declared, he went to Germany and tried to get Irish POWs in German POW camps to come back into the war on the German side. And even the Germans may have thought this was a little woo-woo. And they put him on a submarine back to Ireland to continue the good work, where he was instantly arrested and put on trial for treason by the very same government which had previously knighted him. He had very distinguished defenders. George Bernard Shaw, an Irishman, by the way. Arthur Conan Doyle. The American Congress begged for clemency for this man. There was some other interesting person who was in his corner, but it wasn't going to work. He was going to be hanged by the same government that knighted him. And at that point, the British Secret Service brings Holmes out of retirement because once he came back from his last bow, he went back to keeping bees in Sussex. But he's brought back to get into a prison cell with Roger Casement, posing as another Irish terrorist, which is what he was doing in the previous 2 years, to see if he can learn things that Roger Casement knows that he's not revealing to the British government. And that's what sets the whole plot of this novel in motion. Because he learns that there is a plan to win the war in something like 12 weeks. And they've worked it all out. They've calculated it down to the last bushel of wheat. England is an island nation. And the only problem is that Casement doesn't really know the plan. So the British Secret Service, which is run by a man named Sir William Melville, who was the first M, except he wasn't because the first M was Mycroft. But he took that in honor of Mycroft, who's deceased by this time. And Holmes and Watson are recruited to go to America and find out what this plan is. And that's the substance of the book.
Great story. Yeah. And then there was also, there's so many interesting facts. There's revolutions going on all over the place.
The revolution in Russia, rebellion in Ireland.
Mexico.
Yeah,
Pancho Villa.
Yeah. And Pancho Villa invaded the United States in Columbia, New Mexico. He made a dash across the border and grabbed a whole bunch of weapons there. And Wilson, who was President Wilson, digging in his heels against any kind of involvement in any war or anything that could be construed by the large German and Irish American populations as coming into the war on the side of the Allies, forced to send General John Blackjack Pershing into Mexico with 12,000 troops to chase Pancho Villa over hill and dale for having invaded the United States. And they never caught him. But Pershing, who led the American Expeditionary Force that eventually landed in France, 1918, to win the war, he had a great sense of history, Pershing. And when he landed, he said, "Lafayette, we are here." And I can never say that without choking up. I just think it's so fantastic. Anyway, that's who Pershing was.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody in the audience has been down to Douglas, Arizona. There's that, I can't remember the name of the old hotel there, where Pancho Villa famously rode into the lobby on his horse and went partially up the stairs. We stayed there. Of course, it's haunted. Great old hotel in Douglas.
It's that horse wandering around.
Yeah. Well, and that whole thing is so fascinating. They had film crews filming Pancho Villa and having him recreate his battles and stuff.
There's a lovely film with, I think it's Wallace Beery as Pancho Villa, and there's a reporter who's always with him. And when he was finally assassinated, he turns to the reporter and he says, "Quick, what are my last words?"
So Gideon Altamont, his alter ego.
Holmes's alter ego. Undercover, yeah.
Yeah. And, the Easter uprising in Ireland is what you're talking about. And there's also, in that complicated history with Germany and Northern Ireland during that time, the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of philosophy.
Yep.
Yeah. What surprises did you have when you were researching the book? Or was
Well,
it fun to research?
Yeah, research is fun. It's the equivalent of when you're directing a movie of going on a location scout. There's no pressure. You're just looking around at interesting things, and you get to eat in loads of restaurants. And the hard part will be making the actual movie, or in this case, writing the actual novel. But in the meantime, you're just reading stories, and you write things down. I walk around with this. This is not Mao's little red book, it's mine. And it has, important things like pick up dry cleaning. Well, no, wait, that's not a good example, but some other things are there that are, or good words to put into an Edwardian novel, like the other day I came across Downcast, and I thought, Downcast is good. I've just finished the 7th of my Sherlock Holmes stories, which is Sherlock Holmes and the Real Thing, which is about art forgery. And so you find these words, and then you look for places in the story to put them where they sound cool or authentic, or at least that's my method. And you walk around, and I read a lot of books. I read 2 books years apart, published 50, 60 years apart, that with the same title. It was called The Zimmerman Telegram. The first Zimmerman Telegram book was a history written by Barbara Tuchman, who went on to win the Pulitzer Prize for The Guns of August, wrote The Proud Tower, The First Salute, The March of Folly. She wrote a lot of books, A Distant Mirror. And then 50 years later, or maybe it's more, a guy named Thomas Boghart, who was a naval historian, wrote another book called The Zimmerman Telegram. And this is the telegram that got America into World War I. And so reading all about that, and then learning that the secret agent who got his hands on the telegram in Mexico went by the code name H. You can't make this shit up. I mean, it's just a... So I didn't need to. But when I was doing this book, I was pretty good on things in England. I was cool with that, and I knew places in America, or I could look up things that I didn't know about the places that he went in America. But by the time I got to Mexico, I had to go to Mexico, because I once made a movie in Mexico with Tom Hanks and John Candy called Volunteers in Mexico. It was supposed to be Thailand, but I didn't really get to see any of Mexico because I was making the movie. So I went to the telegraph office in Mexico City. Now Mexico, in the run up to I can't remember, it was 1910 or something, was run by a dictator named Porfirio Diaz for something like 31 or 41 years. And I don't know what he did for Mexico, but he redecorated and redesigned a lot of Mexico City as if it were Paris. Spent a lot of money. And when you see the post office, it looks like Versailles. Not kidding. And when you see the telegraph office, there's murals on the top of the telegraph office that, kind of look like the thing you find on the top of the Sistine Chapel, except it's all pictures of telegraph wires and scaffolding with angels and things flying around them. But it's all about the telegraph, because he was very proud of the telegraph. And there's a whole exhibit simply devoted to the Zimmerman telegram in the telegraph office in Mexico City. So that stuff I didn't know, and that stuff I had to see. So that's what I did.
Isn't B. Traven kind of wandering around at roughly the same time? Whoever that might be.
Whoever B. Traven really was. Do we know about The Treasure of the Sierra Madre? And there was another guy who wrote The Incident at Owl Creek Bridge, Ambrose Bierce.
Ambrose Bierce,
who was
famously
also down there.
disappeared.
Disappeared. Everybody disappears. Well, we all disappear.
We all disappear. Yeah. That took it to a strange, strange place really quickly.
Well, I'm at that age.
So Sir William Melville, the original M. That whole period is so fascinating to think about. You know, this in 1916. Obviously, we're in the middle of the 1418 War, as they call it, right? And these different things that are developing in the intelligence community. You know, J. Edgar Hoover just getting his start over here.
It was called the Bureau of Intelligence.
Yeah.
It became the FBI, but it was the BOI. And they operated out of a house on K Street, which is a street in Washington that has little letters for streets, yeah.
And so just in the span of the kind of the Holmes or, you know, Doyle's Holmes stories, what are the dates roughly on those? 1880.
Well, the first story, A Study in Scarlet, was published, I believe, in 1887.
Yep.
In the Beaton's Christmas Annual. And the last story, which is his last bow, I don't know if it's the last one that was written, but it was the last one that was in the series, in chronology, was
17.
the last bow, 1914.
Oh, 14. Okay.
What's remarkable about these stories, there are 56 short stories and 4 novellas, is the high level of quality of all of them. They all are, you know, pretty remarkably good. And one other thing that interests me a lot, and I don't know about whether you know this, but in 1916, Arthur Conan Doyle became a convinced spiritualist. There were so many people who were killed in the First World War. Millions. Everybody had lost a brother, a father, a son. They were all killed. That a lot of people started trying to contact the dead. There was a lot of Ouija boards and a lot of mediums. And Arthur Conan Doyle, who lost a son, a brother, and a brother-in-law in the war, he suddenly became a convinced spiritualist, and he spent the last 15 years of his life preaching spiritualism, and he had a special bookstore that he kept open at his own expense about spiritualist literature. But one thing he never did was make Sherlock Holmes a spiritualist. He could have. It might have been tempted. But Sherlock says to Watson, "I take it, Watson, that neither of us are prepared to admit diabolical intrusions into the affairs of men. This agency stands flat-footed on the ground. No ghosts need apply." I think it took a lot of guts, a lot of restraint, not to make Holmes into his mouthpiece.
Well, and then 1916, when you pick up the story here, Holmes is mid-60s, right?
66 years old, the way I calculate it.
And then, you know, Watson, they both have this call. They want to serve in some way.
Yes. Everybody was fighting to get into the war. War is very attractive. Everybody says, first of all, the war will be short. World War I, they all said, home before the leaves fall. Yeah, well, that was a laugh. But not a very happy laugh. People sign up. You beat the drum. You say, we're looking for a few good men. You take the king's shilling. And the next thing you know, you're legless on the sidewalk and nobody really wants to pay much attention to you. We have a phrase, cannon fodder, disposable, dispersible. And a lot of people signed up, and most of them died. A whole generation of young people, people your age, went into those trenches and never came out. That's okay, you're not going to go, but I'm just trying to put you in the picture.
Yeah, absolutely. The literature that comes out of that period is really interesting too. All the World War I poets and some remarkable
Sassoon,
Graves.
Rupert Graves, yeah.
Yeah. So let's kind of go back again to your first book quickly, because it was a massive bestseller.
Yes, let's not mince words.
I mean,
It was the number one best-selling novel for 40 weeks on the
40
New York
weeks.
Times bestseller list.
Yeah.
And there was the movie,
There was the movie.
which I wrote, and
What a
that-
cast.
That was my Oscar nomination. I lost to Richard Nixon. It was
Do you have
All
any,
the President's Men won.
Do you have any Olivier
They had
stories?
help. What?
Any Olivier stories?
Yes, well, the full Olivier story, to explain, Laurence Olivier, who was, I guess, Marlon Brando's rival for who was the greatest actor of that generation. He was the English answer to it. I had a man crush on Laurence Olivier when I was about 7 years old, and it was the first movie I'd ever was taken to see, and we didn't have a TV, so I didn't know what a movie was. And I just fell for this guy really hard. And if you'd told me then that one day he was going to be speaking my silly dialogue, I wouldn't have known what to make of that. But the point is that when I finally got to meet him and he was going to play Professor Moriarty in the book that I wrote, and writing is lonely. You're sitting there doing this and you think, no one's going to ever pay any attention to this. And then the next thing you know, Nick, I'd like you to meet Sir Laurence Olivier, Lord Olivier by that point. He's going to be playing, and he was 3 days on the set playing Moriarty. And I just watched him like a hawk, and I had lunch with him for 3 days in the studio commissary. And he was a font of stories, and he kept calling me dear boy until I realized that he didn't know my name. He was saying, dear boy, where are you from, dear boy? And I said, well, I'm from New York, but I live in Hollywood. He goes, oh, Hollywood. In 1939, Viv and I, we were the king and queen of that place. I'd just done Wuthering Heights. She'd just done Gone with the Wind. They couldn't do enough for us. And then the war came. And I had to be a good boy. And he made this world-weary gesture about they had to go home. And one studio said, don't go home. If you don't go home, we'll give a Spitfire in your name. And another studio said, don't pay any attention to that studio. If you don't go home, we'll give a Lancaster bomber in your name. It was like that. And I just was listening to all these stories. He was also a very good mimic. Olivier could really mimic. And at one point, we got to talking about My Fair Lady and Rex Harrison. He said, yes, we always thought it was rather droll that he was going to be an elocutionist and professor of speech because Rex always had such difficulty with his OUs.
Just priceless stuff.
Well, it's the only business, as far as I know, where you get to shake hands with your dreams. And you've seen this guy in the movies.
And so how old were you when that book came out?
I think it was about 28.
28. And
it's 50 years ago, and I'm 78, so...
the math adds up, yeah.
Yikes.
So people often ask, talk about your path to publication. But how did you get this book published?
Okay. So I write the book, and at the end of it, I think, okay, this has got to be somewhat good. Someone will publish this. So I call the East Coast branch of the agency that represents me, and the lit offices are in New York. And the lady says, well, there's really no point in my reading this book because I've never read any Sherlock Holmes, so how could I tell if it was any good? And I was much less pleasant back then than I am now. Now I'm very pleasant. But then I said, well, putting aside the fact that you call yourself a literary agent and you've never read any Sherlock Holmes, this thing, if it depends on another book, is already a flop. This struck me as an unassailable line of argument. But she'd hung up long since. So they weren't going to represent my book. I knew one person in the publishing business. I grabbed my manuscript and spent my money and flew to New York, where it was pissing rain, and I went to Macmillan, where my friend that I sort of knew had been an editor, and I got there, and they said, "Oh, he doesn't work here anymore." It just never occurred to me, like, to call or anything like that. And I said, "But is he still in the publishing business?" And they said, "Well, let's check." So this receptionist is, and I'm dripping all over the carpet. And she says, "Oh, yes, he's at this other company." And I said, "Can I have the address?" So she said, "Yeah, all right." So she gave me the address, and then I traipsed over there. He came out very surprised to see me. "I thought you were in California going to seek your fortune." I said, "Yeah, I'm seeking it. But meantime, I wrote a novel." He goes, "Oh, well, good luck, because I've tried to get them to publish. We're a nonfiction house. I've submitted 5 novels here, and they have passed on every one of them." By this time, I'm really running out of steam, and I said, okay, here's the thing. Here's the book. I'm going home because I don't know what else to do. So I flew home. And 5 or 6 days later, he calls up and he goes, "This one they'll publish." And I said, "Whoa." And he made me an offer that was something like, I can't remember, $3,000, $4,000, which is like a fortune to me. And still sounds pretty good. So I by this time I had a lawyer that I had met someplace, and I said, "What kind of lawyer are you?" And he said, "I'm an entertainment lawyer." And I said, "What's that?" And he sort of told me. So I said, "So if I ever need a lawyer, will you be my lawyer?" And he said, "Yeah." So now I call him up and I say, "Here's the thing. I don't want that stupid agency making 10% negotiating a contract on a book they didn't even read, let alone sell." And so his name was Tom Pollock. He later went on to be head of Universal Pictures. And he said, "Okay, we'll get a release from your literary efforts, and let me read the book, and, I'll handle it." So he reads the book, and he says, "Okay, we're not going to go with that publishing house. They're a nonfiction house. Your book will get lost there." So the next thing you know, the book got sold to another house, Harcourt Brace Jovanovich, and it stayed there for a while I got into all kinds of legal entanglements with the estate of Arthur Conan Doyle, because I had written the book erroneously believing that Holmes was out of copyright. Somebody said, "Where ignorance is bliss, 'tis folly to be wise." If I had known, I wouldn't have written the book. So I just went ahead and then found out, okay, got problems. And so Harcourt Brace Jovanovich was not seemingly lifting a finger to help resolve my problems with the Conan Doyle estate. Meanwhile, an editor from another publishing house called me up. Someone had slipped him the book. And he said, "What are they offering?" And I said, "Well, I think it's about $6,000. He said, "Well, I'll offer $7," And I said, "But, I have a deal. I have a contract." He said, "Okay." And he would come back a week or two later and say, "How about 8?" And the number just kept growing. And finally, I can't remember the exact thing, but I made a deal with the Conan Doyle estate, which was no 7% solution, I can tell you. They took a bite. They were very greedy. They no longer have any authority because he's out of copyright. Any of you can write your own Sherlock Holmes. I wish you wouldn't, because I don't want any of the more competition than I have. But I said, "Can I have my book back?" And they said, "Oh, sure." So then it went over to E.P. Dutton, and that's where the first 2 Sherlock Holmes books were published.
Wow. And so obviously they wanted a follow-up to that after it was such a tremendous success. And then
Yeah, at first I didn't want to do it. I didn't sort of want to be in the Sherlock Holmes business, which look what happened. But I had a glancing acquaintance with Francis Ford Coppola, and I was invited
Most
to.
of us do.
Well, oh, good. I was having dinner at his house. He was making spaghetti for a lot of people. And this was 3 days before he won the Oscar for Godfather 2. And I said, "Can I ask you a question?" I said, "Why did you do Godfather 2?" Because I'm trying to think whether I should do another Sherlock. And he said, "Well, there were 3 reasons. And the first reason was they backed up a truck with a lot of money in it." And I thought, this gives me the right to fail. Your art is a feast or famine business. This is going to be rainy day money. This buys me food for if things go wrong. This will send my kid to school or whatever. So you sock that away, which that was, the first reason. And the second reason, he said, I was curious to see if I could go back to the Corleone family for more material. Could I mine more gold out of the same vein? And the third thing he said, and it's only the first answer that really counts for me, but the third thing he said was, I was always troubled because I thought Godfather was an amoral movie. Not an immoral movie, but an amoral movie. And I didn't have the power to do anything about it. But on Godfather 2, I wanted to make a moral movie, and that's what he did. Anyway, the end result of that was why I agreed to do the West End Horror, which is a novel. If you've not read it, you must not sleep. It's a novel about a pandemic.
And then, by the way, there's a lot in this new book that felt some of the issues of various global alliances and things of that nature that felt very contemporary.
Well, I didn't have to stretch it. I didn't have to do much to make these things contemporary. History has a dreary habit of repeating itself. And I think it was a man named George Santana who said, those who do not learn the lessons that history teaches are condemned to repeat those lessons. Unfortunately, we never seem to learn the lessons. Yeah. I mean, if Hitler had paid any attention to Napoleon, he never would have invaded Russia. I mean, that's like, don't do that. Well, it doesn't work.
And you remind us about the incident, what kind of kicked off World War I in Serbia, right?
Yeah, so, a guy named Prinčep, I think it was his name, a student, assassinated the Archduke and the Archduchess of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They were idiots and stupid, bad people, but going around shooting people, it's awful hard to put the toothpaste back in the tube. And everybody said, oh, this is going to, be a short war. But there were all these entangling alliances. Serbia had an alliance with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which had an alliance with Germany that said, go for it. Mm-hmm. And then, on the other hand, Russia had an alliance with France and England on the other hand. So then they had to come into it. And even somehow Australia got into it. And the next thing you know, a lot of blood was being spilled. Oceans, a Red Sea.
And the same questions about, American isolationism come into play here.
We've always believed until very recently, and with some reason, that we were protected by our oceans. We had the Atlantic on one side, Pacific on the other side, and till there are supersonic missiles, we were looking pretty good. Oh, that's okay. Let's just hope for the best.
Looks okay.
Yeah, looks are deceiving. Anyway, I always do that, and that's why I have this this is not supposed to be a commercial, but this thing called Otter. You put the Otter case on, and that helps a lot. That's a life lesson for those of you who came here tonight.
So let's I'm sure people have a lot of questions.
Well,
Anybody?
if anybody has any questions, I'll try to answer.
All right. So,
There's
all right,
not
so
a lot of questions.
well, I got plenty of them. So after the first two books, there's a bit of a chunk of time between the first two and the Canary Trainer, which was 1990s.
Yes, in the early 90s, yeah. Well,
You were busy.
I was very busy doing Star Trek movies,
Yep.
among other things. Time after time, I was the first movie I directed, and then I wrote and directed Star Trek 2, and I wrote most of Star Trek 4, and then I co-wrote and directed Star Trek 6. And there were other things. I made a movie about nuclear war called The Day After, which was 1983, which is the movie that changed Ronald Reagan's mind about a winnable nuclear war, sent him to Reykjavik to meet Soviet Premier Gorbachev and sign the Intermediate Missile Range Treaty, which is the only treaty that ever resulted in the physical dismantling of nuclear weapons. So that's you can put that on my tombstone. If you thought I planned any of this, you're mistaken. It's just the way it happened. But I was supposed to be doing a movie with, I think, Francis Coppola, and it took a year to put this movie deal together, which was much longer than I ever thought it was going to take. And suddenly, I needed work. I needed a job. And so I was in a bookstore in London, because I was living in London, and I saw the book of The Phantom of the Opera. And I didn't even know there was a book of the Phantom. I just know the movie. And so I was standing there looking at it. And in the introduction, somebody said, "Oh, it's interesting that Sherlock Holmes never crossed paths with the Phantom, because the dates really..." And the hairs in the back of my neck stood up, and I looked around. Is anybody looking? Does anybody know this book? And then I went home and, as fast as I could, wrote another Sherlock Holmes story, The Canary Trainer, which is Sherlock and the Phantom. Because I guess I write them, two things have to happen. One is I have to have the time, and two is I have to have the idea. I think the next one was the Protocols, right?
That was 2019.
Something like that. How many people here know about the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion? You've heard of it. You've heard of it. Okay. The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, which I invite you to Google, is the most famous, successful, long-lasting, vicious, and destructive hoax of all time. And no matter how many times it's exposed as a hoax, it refuses to die. And what is it? The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion purports to be the minutes of a secret meeting of Jews plotting to take over the world. And it was put out by the secret police of Tsar Nicholas II in 1905, the Okhrana. That's the secret police. And it was probably put out to explain why Russia was such a third world country with lousy roads, no education, no manufacturing. Blame it on somebody. And it's never died. Vladimir Putin quotes them. They're taught in Louisiana. They've made into a TV series in Egypt. It's a Muslim textbook. Henry Ford published all of them in his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent. That newspaper had the largest circulation of any paper in the country except the Daily News. And he got sued for libel, and he had to close down his paper because they're fake. They're fake. But I thought...
Did L. Ron Hubbard ever get a piece of that story? It seems like it would be up his alley.
Scientology. You gotta love that stuff. I mean, what's the difference anyway between a cult and a religion? I can tell you in one word: numbers. If you have 12 people sitting around a table, they're the disciples. That's okay. But if you have 12 million, that's that's a religion. Anyway, so yes, the protocols do not go away, and that was my fourth. Was that the fourth? That was the fourth one. And the fifth one was The Return of the Pharaoh, which is about Holmes in Egypt in 1911. It's about archaeology. Yes, you've got the right book. Buried Treasure. Howard Carter and King Tut and all that stuff. That also. And then this one and the one that's next.
What can you tell us about the one that's next? Anything?
It's about art forgery, and it's not about Holmes in 1916, which is sort of at the end of his career. It's back in the 1890s, so he's a much younger man, and it doesn't leave the country. It stays in London, and it's what you learn about art forgery. And the reason I got interested in forgery is because it turns out I'm a forger. When I wrote the 7% solution, I got sent on a book tour, kind of like this, except the publisher paid back then. So I flew through a thunderstorm and landed in Pittsburgh, very green. And I was approached by a reporter, a young reporter, who clearly felt he had more important things to do than interview some kid novelist. And he said, "So how does it feel to be a successful forger?" That was his opener. And I said, well, it doesn't say by Nicholas Meyer. It says as edited. But, I could try to wiggle off the hook. But I went to bed in the hotel that night. It really got under my skin, and it got me interested in forgery. What is a forger? What's the difference between a forgery and a copy? Something you can't see. The intention. A copy announces itself. I'm a copy. It says so somewhere. A forgery tries to make you believe it's the real thing. And there are all kinds of moral, ethical, aesthetic questions attached to it. Put another way, and by the way, if everybody starts yawning, I'll know when we've gone too far with this. But all works of art are ineluctably products of the time in which they were created. Mozart doesn't just sound like Mozart. He sounds like late 18th century Middle European music. Renoir doesn't just look like Renoir. He looks like late 19th century French Impressionism. And that's fine. It's always going to be that way. If I show you 5 movies that supposedly take place in 1776, and one movie takes place in 1920, and one movie takes place in 1950, and one movie takes place in 1980, and so on, you would be able to tell within 5 minutes and 5 years when those movies were made. 1,000 details would give them away. How long are the eyelashes? What are the hairstyles? Is it real candlelight, or is it whatever? And also what's coming out of their mouths. What sentiments, what politics, what philosophy. And that's fine. All of that's fine. But it does play hell with us forgers. Because our forgeries, too, are products of the time in which they're created. This is 2024. There was a famous forger named Han van Meegeren who forged Vermeers in the 30s. And those Vermeers were sold for hundreds of thousands of pounds. And they were in museums, and they were authenticated. And if you look at them now, they stink. They stink. They look like Art Deco. Nobody saw it at the time. They said, oh, this is Vermeer, no question. But it jumps out at you later. So these things, are the best that I know how to do, but I'm sure I can't keep 2024 or my own interests out of them.
Now, maybe like a last question or two. The Sherlock Holmes community is, you get those groups that are really serious. And
There's
they
a
get
Sherlock Holmes Society in
they get
every city in the world.
and they get super nerdy and academic. Some of them do, and then the continuations, if you will. I hate no pastiche, but whatever.
The
They
sequels.
they run the gamut of people taking all these different approaches to these characters. And I was going to ask
I
at
have
the
a
beginning.
porno Holmes.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's John.
It's a gay Sherlock Holmes character. All the stories are the same, except every person in it is a boy. There's no girls.
Wow.
The
Subversive.
sexual adventures of Sherlock Holmes.
Wow. As told too.
And there's the science fiction. It's Watson still telling me. They didn't even change the rest of it. It's just whatever. There's a sci-fi Sherlock Holmes. There's modern day Sherlock Holmes. There's Sherlock. There's Elementary.
Mm-hmm.
There's all kind of riffs on it.
Do you have any favorites in like on-screen representations of Sherlock Holmes?
Well, again, I'm very, very conservative. I like Holmes that reminds me of what I read. So I think the Peter Cushing Hound of the Baskervilles, which was, I think, in the 60s, was pretty straight-on Sherlock Holmes. There was a TV series with Leslie Howard's son, Ronald Howard, and an actor named H. Marion Crawford as Watson that also seemed to me, and I'm sure it was done very much on the cheap, but that seemed to me no-nonsense Holmes. I also like the Billy Wilder Private Life of Sherlock Holmes. I like that a lot. And I like the comic one, which is called Without a Clue, where Holmes is the dummy and Watson is the smart one. And Michael Caine plays Holmes and Ben Kingsley plays Watson. Dr. Watson, crime doctor, is how he sees himself. And I think that I've made me laugh and laugh, that one.
So Jeremy Brett or Basil Rathbone?
My problem with Basil Rathbone, besides Nigel Bruce and besides the fact that they take it out of period, is that I can never see Basil Rathbone thinking. I can never see the wheels turning. When I see Benedict Cumberbatch, when you look at Gary Cooper, you can see, not that he played Holmes, but there are actors where you can see the wheels going round. And I think Basil Rathbone looks like Sherlock Holmes. He sounds like Sherlock Holmes, but I just never see any suggestion of intellectual process going on. Jeremy Brett is a big favorite of a lot of people. I find him a little twitchy for my.
Well, there is the cocaine.
But do we see him do it in the Jeremy Brett ones? I don't know.
Maybe.
I tend not to read a lot of other Sherlock Holmes imitations for the simple reason that I'm very insecure and I know I'll come away thinking they're better than what I can do, and then that makes me sad. So I don't read a lot of the other ones. I've read some and I came away thinking, oh, these are better.
You mentioned the copyright issue that you had a problem with early on. What did Leslie Klinger do to?
Leslie Klinger, who is the author of the new annotated 2-volume Sherlock Holmes that's sitting out there, is by profession, I think, an estate lawyer, but he is a lawyer. And he did his homework about these copyrights, and he took them to court, and he won. It used to be the richest literary estate, and all the heirs could think of was not Sherlock Holmes, but money, which I found deeply disillusioning and offensive.
So now those Doyle kids have to get real jobs, is what you're saying?
Yeah, they were not a pleasant bunch, and their descendants or offspring or marital offspring the marrying Mitivanis. You have to Google it. They sort of ran it into the ground, and what they would wait for is they'd wait for your movies about to come out, and then they'd hit you with some bullshit injunction about the thing is still in copyright. And you would have two choices. If you're Warner Brothers or MGM, whatever, you could take them to court and you'd win, or you could pay $10,000 and they'd go away. So guess what they would do time after time,
Cash grab kind of
yeah.
scheme.
So, and they did that. They did that with the Ian McKellen thing, Mr. Holmes. They would just pay him money and then they go away. I haven't had to pay them money in a long time. I don't believe I'll ever have to pay them money again.
Anybody have any thoughts before we wrap it up?
You mentioned that you thought that Without a Clue was funny. Are you familiar with the Peter Cook, Dudley Moore version of The Hound of the Baskervilles?
I know about it. Is it good? Should I?
Genius.
I have to watch it every couple of months.
Every couple of months. Okay, all right.
It is really something. Yeah, I mean, Peter Cook, total genius in my view.
Well, he was some kind of genius, that's for sure.
Dudley
I knew
too.
him.
Did you really?
Yeah, I did know him. He was in Hollywood. A lot of times Hollywood can't figure out what to do with English actors. So they either play the maid or the butler. And he came to Hollywood at a certain point, and for a season was playing the butler on some TV series. And I knew a guy who knew him, and we would all play tennis on Saturday mornings. And I would go to pick him up at the Chateau Marmont, and he'd always come out very red-faced with a cigarette kind of dangling out. And he'd sit in my car, and I'd say, Pete, you look a little under the weather. And he always had a reason why he was up at 3 a.m. It was Princess Diana's wedding, or it was Anwar Sadat's funeral. It was always some strange thing that had him up. And then we'd play tennis, and he'd be very red in the face by the time I finished. I thought, this is not good. And then I would drive him home. That's my and he came to dinner one night at my house, and he was so funny. He was unbelievably funny. And then he fell asleep at the table. And that could have been the funniest thing, but it wasn't, because it's just like the plug was pulled. And
then he and Dudley had their alter egos, which were Derek and Clive, which were their much raunchier, risque. We digress. I'm sorry. We're getting into the weeds here, but anybody else have any?
You mentioned a new annotated version of the whole Holmes.
there are 2 annotated Holmes.
I had the one from like
The Baring Gould.
Yeah, W.S. Baring Gould. That's the first one. And Les Klinger, if you look on the front table, not that you're going to buy those books, because you have to buy this one.
Buy both.
But anyway, you will see the 2-volume annotated, and it's annotated with a different philosophical approach by Les than by W.S. Baring Gould. I, of course, own them both, because geekiness never dies. That's it.
So you talked about the Canary Trainer and how you got the idea for that. With the rest of them, is it kind of like it comes to you in a moment of inspiration? Do you start with the moral question or the plot, or is it always different? Like, how do the ideas come for you?
Well, your question is part of a larger question, which is, where do ideas come from anyway? An apple falls on Newton's head, and suddenly we're into gravity. I don't know where ideas come from, and I'm very self-conscious at this point about trying to figure out where they come from. All I know is you're minding your own business, doing something mundane. Some years ago, I was hired to write a screen adaptation of Philip Roth's The Human Stain. And I had 6 weeks, and I hadn't read the book, and I had 6 weeks to read the book and come up with an approach to the movie. And 6 weeks, I read the book. I was totally knocked out by it. I think it was a home run. And I could not, and 6 weeks became 5 weeks, became 3 weeks, became 1 week. My girlfriend said, why don't you just tell him the truth? You just, you don't got it. And that came as a big relief to me. And I was sitting in the tub. This was back when L.A. had water. Because I like to sit in the tub and watch my toes. You remember your toes get wrinkled when they're in the... That's kind of interesting. And I was minding my own business, wondering why my toes get wrinkled. And then suddenly I figured it out. It was like tumblers in a safe. Tick, 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 act 1, tick, 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 act 2. And I didn't dare move while the water got cold because I was afraid that if I moved, I would lose what I had figured out. Like when you wake up from a dream and the dream seems so real and you really want to remember it, but you don't most of the time. You just don't.
We're just having that conversation.
I don't know where these things come from. Maybe we'll end on this. Socrates is told by the oracle at Delphi that he's the wisest man in Greece. And he thinks, that can't be right. So all I have to do to disprove it is to find someone wiser than me. So he goes talking to all segments of Greek society and finally gets around to the poets. And I think for our purposes, he probably means artists of any kind. Painters, poets, sculptors, whatever. And he thinks, surely these people who have written or painted or sculpted so insightfully about the human condition will prove to be wiser than me. He says, imagine my surprise that the poets were the stupidest people I spoke to. They were like children. They were infantile. Except when they did their art. And then they go into a kind of trance and take dictation from God. And this they call inspiration. And then you come up for air and it's hours later. You don't know where you've been or how you did it. And you go back to being a jerk again. And that's as close as I can get to where ideas come from. I have a pretty good memory. So I'll read something that I'll say, that is weird. I'm not making a political statement, but I grab a notebook and maybe write something down. Or the clearest example that we've talked about tonight was the Phantom of the Opera. I just read, somebody says, how come Sherlock never encountered the Phantom? And that was the idea handed me on a plate. It took 10 years to figure out how to do the protocols of the Elders of Zion and put Sherlock Holmes in it. So that's the opposite end of it.
Well, it's been a real treat talking with you. Thanks so much, and thanks for coming out tonight, everybody.
Thank you. Thank
and
you.
everybody online.
For coming out in all this rain and cold.
All this rain and cold, yes. Let's see, where would you like to sign? You wanted to stay here? Or we could put you up at that table.
The table is better. Okay. Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for